I was sitting in a conference room in Memphis when my security camera sent me a notification. I opened the app and watched a man I recognized, my HOA neighbor, Craig, kneel at my cabin door while another man picked the lock. They were inside in 4 minutes. Over the next 48 hours, they changed my locks, moved in a cot and a mini fridge, installed commercial spike strips across my driveway, and settled Craig's mother into my reading chair with a book like she was checking into a bed and breakfast. Craig told the neighbors I'd abandoned the property. I'd owned it for 11 years. What he didn't know was that 6 cameras and 2 interior microphones had been recording every second of his little renovation fantasy. He thought he was taking over a cabin. He was actually building the evidence file for his own eviction. My name is Nathan Crossley. I'm 47 years old. I work as a logistics coordinator for a freight company based out of Knoxville, Tennessee, which means I travel, sometimes for a week, sometimes for 2, occasionally for 3 if a regional hub needs hands-on restructuring. It's a good job. It pays well. But it takes me away from the one place I'd rather be than anywhere else on earth, my cabin. The cabin sits on 6.5 acres at the end of a private gravel road in a community called Ridgecrest Hollow, about 45 minutes northeast of Asheville, North Carolina. I bought the land in 2014 from an elderly couple named the Porters, who'd used it as a weekend hunting property for decades. The cabin was already there, a 1,200 square foot log structure with a tin roof, a stone fireplace, a wraparound porch, and the kind of silence that makes your ears ring for the first 10 minutes until your body remembers what quiet actually sounds like. I spent 2 years renovating it. New plumbing, updated electrical, a proper septic system, insulated the walls, replaced the windows, refinished the heart pine floors until they glowed amber in the afternoon light. I built the bookshelves myself. I hung the porch swing myself. I picked out every piece of furniture, every lamp, every mug on the kitchen hooks. That cabin wasn't a weekend getaway. It was my inheritance to myself. The one thing I built that was entirely mine after a decade of working jobs that belonged to other people. Ridgecrest Hollow is a small community, 31 properties spread across about 200 acres of rolling mountain terrain. It's a mix of full-time residents and weekend owners like me, connected by a single-lane gravel road that winds up from the county highway through a canopy of white oak and tulip poplar. The HOA was formed in 2009, mostly to manage the private road maintenance and the shared water easement that runs through the lower portion of the development. For years, it was run by a retired school teacher named Donna Alcott, who kept things simple. Dues were $200 a year. Meetings happened twice annually in someone's living room, and the biggest controversy in a decade was whether to pave the last quarter mile of the main road. Nobody paved it. Everybody was fine with that. Then Donna retired from the board in 2023, and a man named Craig Devlin took over. Craig was 41, recently divorced, and had moved to Ridgecrest full-time after selling a landscaping business in Raleigh, under circumstances I'd later learn more about. He had the energy of someone who desperately needed a project, and the temperament of someone who believed every problem in the world was caused by other people not listening to him. He ran for HOA president unopposed, because nobody else wanted the job, and most people didn't even attend the meeting, and immediately started treating the position like a municipal appointment with enforcement powers. New bylaws drafted without input, a property standards committee that he chaired alone, monthly inspections of exterior maintenance that nobody had asked for, fines for things that had never been fined before in the community's 15-year history, overgrown hedges, visible tarps on firewood stacks, vehicles parked on grass instead of gravel pads, satellite dishes that were aesthetically inconsistent. In 12 months, he turned a quiet mountain community into a place where people checked their mailboxes with a knot in their stomach. I mostly stayed off Craig's radar because I wasn't there often enough to bother him. My cabin was at the very end of the road, set back 100 yards from the last property, screened by a stand of mature hemlock trees, invisible from any other house. I paid my dues on time every year. I kept the place clean and maintained. I waved when I saw him on the road. He waved back. For a while, that was enough. But Craig had a particular interest in my property that I didn't understand until much later. He'd asked me twice, once at a community cookout, once when I passed him on the road, whether I'd ever consider selling. Both times I said no, firmly but politely. Both times he smiled a tight little smile and said, "Just checking. Beautiful piece of land up there." I didn't think much of it at the time. I should have. The trip that started everything was a 16-day assignment to our Memphis hub in late October 2025. A distribution center was being restructured, and they needed someone on site to manage the transition. I packed a bag, locked the cabin, set the security system, and drove to the airport on a Monday morning. The security system was something I'd installed 2 years earlier, after a black bear broke through the crawlspace vent and got into the storage room underneath the cabin. After that, I put in 4 exterior cameras, 2 interior cameras, motion-activated floodlights, and a cellular modem that uploaded footage to a cloud server whenever motion was detected. The system ran on a combination of shore power and a small solar backup panel. It wasn't military grade, but it was thorough. I could pull up a live feed on my phone from anywhere with cell service. For the first 10 days of the trip, everything was quiet. The cameras triggered a few times. Deer in the yard, a raccoon on the porch, a UPS truck that turned around in my driveway by mistake. Normal cabin stuff. On day 11, a Thursday, I got a motion alert at 2:47 p.m. I opened the app on my lunch break and saw Craig Devlin standing on my front porch. He was wearing work boots and a flannel shirt, and he had a clipboard under his arm. He knocked on the door, waited, knocked again. Then he walked around the cabin, peering in windows, checking the crawl space access panel, looking at the electrical meter. He spent about 12 minutes walking the perimeter before getting back in his truck and driving away. I thought it was odd, but not alarming. Craig did his little inspection rounds. Maybe he was checking exterior maintenance while I was gone. Annoying, but not worth a confrontation. The next day, Friday, another motion alert. This time Craig was back, and he wasn't alone. He had a younger guy with him, someone I didn't recognize, carrying a toolbox. They walked up to the front door. Craig pulled something from his pocket. I watched in real time as the younger guy knelt at my front door and began working on the lock. I sat in a conference room in Memphis with my phone under the table, watching a stranger pick my cabin door lock while Craig Devlin stood behind him with his hands on his hips like a foreman supervising a job site. They were inside in under 4 minutes. The interior cameras caught everything. Craig walked through the main room, opened cabinets, checked the kitchen, looked in the bedroom. The younger guy started measuring walls with a tape measure. Craig pointed at the fireplace and said something I couldn't hear clearly on the audio. The cellular upload compressed the sound, but the motion of his hands suggested he was describing changes, renovations, plans. They were inside for 37 minutes. Before they left, Craig taped a piece of paper to the inside of the front door. The camera caught enough of it to read the header. Notice of Property Abandonment Review, Ridgecrest Hollow, HOA. My hands were shaking. Not from fear, from the specific kind of fury that comes when someone walks into your home uninvited and starts measuring the walls like they already own it. I called my neighbor, Helen Pace, who lived 3 properties down and had been in the community since 2011. I asked her if she'd seen anything unusual. She said Craig had mentioned at the last HOA meeting that he was concerned about an abandoned property at the end of the road, and that he planned to take steps to secure it. She said she'd told him the cabin wasn't abandoned, that I traveled for work and came up on weekends when I could. Craig had apparently waved that off and said, "If nobody's living there full time, it's a liability to the whole community." Helen said she'd pushed back. She'd told Craig she had my phone number, that she could call me and confirm I was fine, that the property was maintained and the taxes were current. Craig said he'd handle it through proper channels. Helen told me she didn't like the way he said it. Like, proper channels meant whatever Craig decided they meant. I thanked Helen. I told her I was aware of the situation and would be handling it when I got back. She said, "Nathan, be careful with this one. He's not like Donna. He doesn't ask, he announces." I hung up. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed in Memphis with my phone in my hands, looking at a still frame from my security camera. Craig Devlin's back as he walked out of my cabin, closing the door behind him like a man leaving his own house. I opened a new folder on my laptop and named it Devlin. Then I started downloading every frame of footage from the last 48 hours, one clip at a time, saving them with timestamps and descriptions like I was building a case file, because that's exactly what I was doing. The next 3 days were the longest of my professional life. I had 4 more days on the Memphis assignment and no way to leave without jeopardizing a contract my company had spent 6 months negotiating. So I watched. I watched my phone like a man watching his house burn from across a river. Saturday morning, motion alert. Craig returned with the same younger guy and a third person, an older woman I later identified as his mother, Patrice Devlin, who had recently moved into his house after selling her condo in Fayetteville. They brought a pickup truck. From the truck, they unloaded a folding cot, a plastic storage bin, a mini refrigerator, a space heater, and a cardboard box that appeared to contain food and kitchen supplies. They carried everything inside through the front door, which Craig now opened with a key. He'd had my lock rekeyed. The original deadbolt was gone. In its place was a new brushed nickel handle set that still had a price sticker on the base plate. I watched them set up the cot in the main room, against the wall where I keep my bookshelves. They plugged the mini fridge into the kitchen outlet, the same outlet I'd wired myself during the renovation, running 12-gauge Romex through the wall cavity because the original wiring wasn't up to code. They positioned the space heater near the fireplace, which struck me as ironic. If you're going to squat in someone's cabin, at least use the fireplace. Craig's mother settled into my reading chair, the leather wingback I'd found at an estate sale in Waynesville, and spent 3 weekends reupholstering with burgundy leather, and opened a book like she was checking into a bed and breakfast. She looked comfortable. She looked like she planned to stay. Craig walked through the cabin one more time, checking windows, adjusting the position of furniture, opening the pantry, and examining what was inside. At one point he stood in the doorway of the bedroom and looked at the bed I'd built from reclaimed barn wood, a headboard I'd spent 40 hours sanding and finishing, and I could see him nodding to himself on camera. Then he and the younger guy went outside. That's when I saw the spike strips. They unloaded 2 commercial tire spike strips from the truck bed, the kind you see at parking garage exits and rental car return lanes, with retractable steel teeth that deploy when you drive over them in the wrong direction. These weren't homemade. They were manufactured units, bright yellow with black chevron markings, designed to puncture tires moving in one direction while allowing passage in the other. Craig and the younger guy laid railroad ties across the gravel driveway, about 40 feet from the cabin, then bolted the spike strips to the ties using heavy-duty lag bolts and a cordless impact driver. They leveled the ties with gravel fill and tested the mechanism by walking over it from both directions. The installation took about an hour. When they were done, Craig stood back, put his hands on his hips, surveyed the setup, and nodded the way a man nods when he's satisfied with a job well done. My gravel driveway, my private road, commercial spike strips bolted into railroad ties, like he was fortifying a military compound against incoming vehicles. Anyone who drove up to my cabin without knowing the strips were there would blow out at least 2 tires. That included me. That included emergency services. That included anyone with a legitimate reason to be on my property. I sat in my hotel room in Memphis that Saturday evening and felt something I can only describe as controlled rage. Not the hot kind that makes you throw things, the cold kind that makes you start making lists. I opened my laptop and started researching property attorneys in the Asheville area. I called Joan Herrera the next morning. Joan had been recommended by a colleague at work whose family had dealt with a boundary dispute in Henderson County. She'd won that case in 4 months. I described the situation in under 3 minutes, emailed her links to the footage clips, and waited. She called back in 2 hours. Her voice was calm but direct. "You have clear criminal trespass," she said, "breaking and entering, unauthorized modification of a private structure, and the spike strips on a private road could constitute reckless endangerment, depending on how the DA reads it. If an ambulance tried to reach your property and hit those strips, someone could die. This isn't a neighborhood dispute, Nathan. This is a crime." I asked if we should call the sheriff immediately. "We could," she said, "but I want to do something first. I want to pull the HOA records, meeting minutes, any resolution authorizing this action, Craig's correspondence with the board. Because if he did this on his own authority, without board approval, that changes the calculus considerably. And if the board did authorize it, then we've got a much bigger lawsuit against the entire association." Joan sent a paralegal to the county clerk's office the next morning. What they found was thin. Ridgecrest Hollow's HOA records were sparse. Donna Alcott had kept minutes in a spiral notebook during her tenure, and Craig had apparently continued the tradition on loose-leaf paper, filed in a manila folder with no index and no consistent format. The most recent set of minutes, from a meeting 6 weeks earlier, included a single line item near the bottom of the second page. Discussion of abandoned property at end of road. C.D. to investigate and report back. That was it. One line. No motion, no vote, no resolution, no authorization for entry, lock changes, occupancy, or spike strip installation. Craig Devlin had walked into my cabin, had the locks picked, rekeyed the door, moved his mother in, and fortified the driveway with commercial spike strips, all based on a one-line discussion note in a set of loose-leaf minutes that said, "Investigate and report back." Jones said, "He went from investigate to occupy without anyone telling him to. That's not HOA authority. That's not any kind of authority. That's personal initiative dressed up in a clipboard and a flannel shirt." I flew home on a Wednesday. The Memphis assignment was technically done. The restructuring was on track. The new distribution flow was operational, and my regional manager agreed I could wrap up the final reports remotely from North Carolina. I landed in Asheville at 4 in the afternoon, picked up my truck from the long-term lot, and drove straight to Joan Herrera's office on Merriman Avenue. She had the full file ready, footage screenshots printed in color on heavy stock, organized chronologically, a timeline of events laid out on a yellow legal pad in her precise handwriting. The HOA meeting minutes, photocopied from the originals the paralegal had examined at the county clerk's office. A copy of the CC and Rs for Ridgecrest Hollow, tabbed with colored flags. And something I hadn't expected, a comprehensive title search on my property going back to the original land patent. "I pulled your chain of title just to be thorough," Jones said, sliding the title report across the desk. "Clean as a whistle. You bought from the Porters in 2014. They'd owned it since 1987. Before that, the Randall family held it from 1962 to 1987. No liens, no encumbrances, no access easements, no covenant restrictions from any HOA at any point in the property's recorded history. Your land has never been part of any planned community, any subdivision plat, or any homeowner association, period." She also pulled Craig's purchase records. He'd bought his lot in Ridgecrest in early 2023, paying $175,000 for 3 acres, with a modular home he'd had placed on a permanent foundation. His lot was the second to last on the road. Mine was the last. His property shared a boundary with mine along the northern tree line, about 200 feet of shared property line, but the two parcels were entirely separate in every legal sense. Different tax parcel IDs, different deeds, different plat references, no shared structures, no shared utilities, no shared easements of any kind. "There is zero legal basis for anything he did," Jones said, leaning back in her chair. "Not under the CC&Rs, which don't apply to your property. Not under North Carolina property law, which protects private landowners from exactly this kind of intrusion. Not under any legal theory I can construct, or any theory I think his attorney could construct. He broke into your cabin by having the lock picked. He changed your locks without authorization. He installed commercial-grade obstructions on your private driveway that could prevent emergency vehicle access. He moved a third-party occupant into your home. This is textbook criminal trespass with aggravating factors." I asked what we should do first. "First, we go to the sheriff," Jones said. "I want a criminal complaint on file before we do anything else. That establishes the timeline and protects you legally if Craig tries to claim some kind of adverse possession or implied consent down the road." "Adverse possession?" I said. "He's been there 4 days." Joan almost smiled. "Adverse possession in North Carolina requires 20 years of continuous, open, and notorious occupation under a claim of right. He's got 4 days, a mini-fridge, and a cot. It's not a viable legal argument, but people like Craig don't always know what's viable and what's not. They watch a YouTube video about squatters' rights and think they're legal scholars. I want the record clean and clear before he has time to invent a narrative." We drove to the Buncombe County Sheriff's Office the next morning. The building was a low brick structure on the south side of Asheville, and we waited about 40 minutes before being seen by a deputy named Torres, a serious man in his mid-30s, with a notepad and a habit of writing while you talked, which told me he was thorough. I walked him through everything from the beginning: the first motion alert, the exterior inspection, the lock picking, the interior footage, the lock change, the move-in, the spike strips, the abandonment notice. Joan sat beside me and provided the legal context. Torres watched about 6 minutes of the footage on my phone, stopping twice to ask me to rewind so he could see specific details more clearly. He took 4 pages of notes and said he'd send a patrol unit to assess the situation that afternoon and potentially serve a trespass notice. Joan also filed that morning for an emergency ex parte order from the Buncombe County District Court, a civil order requiring Craig Devlin to immediately vacate my property, remove all personal items, restore the original locks at his own expense, and remove the spike strips and any other obstructions from the driveway within 72 hours. The filing included 12 pages of supporting documentation, footage stills with timestamps, the complete title search, the HOA meeting minutes showing no authorization beyond investigate and report, my property tax receipts showing the taxes current through 2025, and a sworn affidavit from me describing the events in chronological detail. The judge reviewed the filing and signed the emergency order that afternoon at 3:15. "Now," Joan said as we left the courthouse with the stamped order in a manila envelope, "we deliver it." The sheriff's deputy and I drove up to Ridgecrest Hollow on a Thursday afternoon. Joan stayed at her office. She said the delivery would be more effective coming from law enforcement than from an attorney, and she was right. She told me to observe, stay calm, and let Torres do the talking. "Your job right now is to be present and silent," she said. "Let him see you. Let him know you're back. That's enough." We turned onto the private gravel road at the bottom of the hollow and drove the 1.5 miles to the end, the cruiser's tires crunching over the packed gravel I'd helped maintain for 11 years. The canopy of tulip poplar and white oak closed overhead like a tunnel. When we reached the spike strips, bright yellow against the gray gravel, bolted to railroad ties that were darker than the surrounding soil, Deputy Torres stopped the cruiser, got out, and walked up to examine them. He crouched down and ran his hand along the teeth. He took photographs from multiple angles. He noted the railroad ties, the lag bolts, the commercial-grade retractable mechanism, the manufacturer's label still visible on the housing. He stood up, shook his head slowly, and said, "This is a residential driveway." I said, "Yes, it is." He said, "If a fire truck needed to get up here, these would shred their tires." Torres radioed for a county maintenance unit to bring bolt cutters and a pry bar. While we waited, I stood in the road and looked at my cabin from 50 feet away. It was the first time I'd seen it in person in almost 3 weeks. Smoke was coming from the chimney. My chimney. Someone had lit a fire in my fireplace using the firewood I'd split and stacked against the west wall last September. The curtains I'd hung in the front windows, the ones my late aunt had given me from her farmhouse in Virginia, had been pulled aside and replaced with what looked like a white bedsheet tacked to the window frame with pushpins. There was a plastic lawn chair on the porch that I'd never seen before, the cheap resin kind you buy at a hardware store for $12, and next to it, a pair of rubber boots that weren't mine, and a ceramic ashtray with 3 cigarette butts in it. Nobody in my cabin had ever smoked. The sight of that ashtray on my porch did something to me that the security footage hadn't quite managed. It made the violation physical, real, immediate. The maintenance unit arrived in 20 minutes, 2 county workers in a flatbed truck. They cut the lag bolts with a pneumatic wrench, pried the railroad ties loose with crowbars, and loaded the spike strips into the truck bed. The whole removal took about 15 minutes. Torres documented it with more photographs and made notes on the damage to my gravel driveway. Deep gouges where the bolts had been, cracks radiating outward from the anchor points. Torres drove up to the cabin and parked in the clearing. I followed in my truck and parked behind him. Craig Devlin came out onto the porch before Torres reached the bottom step. He was holding a coffee mug. My coffee mug, the blue ceramic one I'd bought at a potter's studio in Black Mountain the summer I finished the renovation. The one with the thumbprint glaze on the handle that made it fit my grip perfectly. He looked at the cruiser first, then at me stepping out of my truck, and his expression went through 3 phases in about 2 seconds. Confusion, recognition, and something that almost looked like indignation, like we were the ones who had trespassed. Torres walked up to the porch and handed Craig the court order. Craig set the mug on the porch railing, my mug on my railing, and read the first page. He flipped to the second. His jaw tightened. He looked up and said, "This is ridiculous. The property was abandoned. I was securing it for the community. You should be talking to him about neglecting his responsibilities, not me." Torres said, steady as a fence post, "Sir, the property owner is right there in that truck. The property is not abandoned. The taxes are current. The title is clear. You are in unlawful possession of a private residence. This court order, signed by a Buncombe County District Court judge, requires you to vacate within 72 hours, remove all personal belongings, restore the original locks at your expense, and remove any remaining obstructions from the driveway. Do you understand these terms? Craig looked at me. I was standing next to my truck with my arms at my sides. I didn't wave. I didn't speak. I didn't smile. I just held his gaze the way you hold a line when someone tests it. His mother appeared in the doorway behind him, a paperback book in one hand, and her reading glasses perched on her nose. She looked at the deputy, then at Craig, then at the court order in Craig's hands and said, "Craig, what's happening? Who are these people?" Craig said, "Nothing, Mom. Go inside." His voice was flat, but I caught the edge in it, the sound of a man who knows the room is turned against him but hasn't accepted it yet. Torres repeated the terms clearly and asked again if Craig understood. Craig folded the court order in half, slid it into his back pocket, and went inside without another word. The screen door banged shut behind him. Through the window, I could see his mother stand up from the reading chair and walk toward him, arms out, asking questions I couldn't hear. Torres turned to me and said, quietly, "If he's not out in 72 hours, call us. We'll be back." I didn't go inside the cabin that night. I drove back to Asheville and stayed at a hotel. Joan had advised me not to enter the property while Craig was still there. Any confrontation could complicate the criminal case and give Craig ammunition to claim harassment or provocation. Instead, I spent the evening doing what I do best, organizing information. First, I built the complete footage archive. I downloaded every clip from the cloud server, 47 individual motion-triggered recordings spanning 17 days. I organized them chronologically in folders labeled by date and time. Each clip was annotated with a one-line description. October 24th, 2:47 p.m. Craig Devlin arrives, inspects exterior. October 25th, 1:12 p.m. Lock picked, entry gained, interior inspection. October 26th, 9:33 a.m. Cot, fridge, supplies moved in. Lock rekeyed. October 26th, 11:48 a.m. Spike strips installed on driveway. I burned the entire archive to 2 separate USB drives and gave one to Joan. Second, I compiled every piece of written communication. Helen Pace's account of the HOA meeting where Craig discussed the abandoned property. The meeting minutes showing no authorization beyond investigate and report back. The abandonment notice Craig had taped to my door. My property tax receipts showing current payment. My deed. My title insurance policy. Everything went into a 3-ring binder with tab dividers and a table of contents. Joan called it the most organized client file she'd ever received. I told her I move freight for a living. Documentation is what I do. Third, I pulled Craig's HOA enforcement history. Under North Carolina's Planned Community Act, homeowners have the right to inspect HOA records, including financial statements, meeting minutes, and enforcement actions. I submitted a formal written request to the HOA, addressed to Craig as president, which was a satisfying irony, demanding copies of all violation notices, fines, and enforcement actions taken in the past 18 months. The law required a response within 10 business days. Fourth, I contacted every board member individually. There were 4 besides Craig: a retired nurse named Margaret Cobb, a carpenter named Dean Sills, a woman named Priya Anand, who worked remotely in software, and Helen Pace, who had been appointed to fill a vacancy the previous spring. I called each one and asked the same question. Did you authorize Craig Devlin to enter my cabin, change my locks, move someone in, or install spike strips on my driveway? Every single one said no. Margaret said, "He told us he was going to check on the property and write a report. That's all we agreed to." Dean said, "If I'd known he was going to do all that, I would have said something." Priya said, "This is insane. He told us it was a routine wellness check." I documented every conversation, date, time, and a summary of what was said. Joan later had each board member sign a written statement confirming their version of events. Fifth, I researched Craig's background. Public records are a powerful thing. I found that Craig's landscaping business in Raleigh had been dissolved following a civil judgment against him for unauthorized work on a client's property. He'd removed a row of mature trees without the owner's written consent, claiming verbal approval that was never given. The judgment was for $38,000. He'd sold the business to cover it and moved to Ridgecrest 6 months later. A pattern. He did things without permission, counted on people being too slow or too polite to stop him, and dealt with consequences only when forced. Sixth, I set up a meeting with the full HOA board, minus Craig, for the following Monday evening. Helen offered her house as the location. I told them I'd bring the documentation. Joan said she'd attend by phone if needed. Everything was in position. The court order was served. The criminal complaint was filed. The board members had confirmed they'd never authorized what Craig did, and I had 17 days of high-definition footage showing every step of an occupation that was about to end very badly for the man who started it. Craig did not vacate within 72 hours. He didn't vacate within 96 hours. On day 4, after the court order was served, I drove up to the cabin with Deputy Torres to check compliance. The spike strips were gone. Craig had removed them, probably because they were the most obviously criminal element and the easiest to undo. But the cabin was still occupied. Through the window, I could see the cot, the mini-fridge still plugged in, and Craig's mother sitting in my reading chair with a different book. Craig came out onto the porch and told Torres he was in the process of relocating his mother, and that he needed a few more days. Torres told him the court order wasn't a suggestion, and that failure to comply would result in contempt of court charges and potential arrest. Craig said, "I'm working on it." Torres said, "Work faster." Joan filed a motion for contempt the next morning. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday. In the meantime, Craig made his next move, one that told me everything I needed to know about how he saw this situation. He called an emergency HOA meeting. He sent a notice to all 31 property owners claiming that my aggressive legal action was threatening the stability and governance of the Ridgecrest Hollow community. He framed himself as a defender of neighborhood standards who was being persecuted by an absentee owner. He proposed a resolution that would retroactively authorize his actions as emergency property preservation measures under a provision of the CC and Rs that addressed abandoned or hazardous structures. I read the notice twice, then I called Joan. She laughed, not a polite laugh, a real one. "He's trying to get the HOA to ratify a break-in after the fact," she said. "That's like robbing a bank and then asking the city council to call it a withdrawal." The emergency meeting was scheduled for Saturday afternoon at the Ridgecrest Community Pavilion, a covered picnic area near the main road entrance. I told Joan I planned to attend. She said, "Good, bring the binder." But before the meeting, something else happened. On Friday afternoon, Dean Sills called me. He was agitated. He said Craig had come to his house that morning and told him that if the board didn't support the retroactive resolution, Craig would make sure everyone knows who voted against protecting the community. Dean said it felt like a threat. He said Margaret Cobb had gotten a similar visit. I asked Dean if he'd be willing to put that in writing. He said yes. I called Margaret. She confirmed Craig had visited her too, using nearly identical language. She was willing to sign a statement as well. Joan drafted the statements that evening. Both were signed and notarized the next morning at a UPS store in Asheville, 2 hours before the emergency meeting. I also did one more thing. I contacted the Buncombe County District Attorney's Office and informed them that the subject of an active criminal trespass complaint was now attempting to use his position as HOA president to retroactively authorize the acts that were the basis of the complaint, and that he had visited board members individually to pressure them into supporting the resolution. The DA's office said they would note it in the file. The pieces were all in place. The contempt hearing was set for Tuesday. The criminal complaint was active. The board members had signed statements. The footage was archived. And in 3 hours, Craig Devlin was going to stand in front of his neighbors and try to convince them that breaking into my cabin was a community service. The Saturday meeting was supposed to start at 2 o'clock. I arrived at 1:30. The pavilion was a simple structure, a concrete slab with a metal roof, 4 picnic tables, and a corkboard where someone had pinned a notice about bear-proof trash cans. When I pulled in, there were already 8 cars in the gravel lot. By 2 o'clock, there were 19. In a community of 31 properties, 19 owners present was practically a constitutional convention. Craig had set up a folding table at the front with a microphone that ran off a portable speaker, the kind you'd use for karaoke at a backyard party. He had printed copies of his proposed resolution stacked in a neat pile. He was wearing a button-down shirt, which I'd never seen him wear before. He looked like a man who dressed for a performance. The board members sat at the picnic table nearest the front. Margaret Cobb looked uncomfortable. Dean Sills kept checking his phone. Priya Anand had her laptop open and was taking notes. Helen Pace sat at the end of the table, with her arms crossed and an expression that could best be described as anticipatory. I sat in the back row, a folding chair I'd brought from my truck. I set my binder on my lap and waited. Craig called the meeting to order and launched into his prepared remarks. He spoke for 12 minutes without stopping. He described my cabin as an unoccupied structure that had become a potential hazard and liability to the community. He said he had acted in good faith to preserve the property and protect neighborhood safety. He said the spike strips were a temporary security measure to prevent unauthorized vehicle access during the preservation period. He said his mother's presence was to maintain a human presence and deter vandalism. He never mentioned the lock change. He never mentioned that he'd had the lock picked by someone he'd brought specifically for that purpose. He never mentioned that 4 board members had told him, and told me, that they'd never authorized anything beyond a visual inspection. When he finished, he asked for a motion to approve the retroactive resolution. Silence. Nobody moved. Craig looked at Dean. Dean looked at the table. Craig looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at her hands. Finally, Craig said, "I'll entertain a motion from the floor." More silence. Helen Pace raised her hand. Craig pointed to her with visible relief. Helen stood up and said, "I'd like to make a motion, but not the one you're expecting." She turned to face the room. "Before we vote on anything Craig has proposed, I think we should hear from the property owner. Nathan Crossley is here today, and he has documentation that I believe every person in this room needs to see before they cast any vote." Craig's face tightened. He said, "This meeting is about the resolution. Mr. Crossley can submit comments in writing." Dean Sills, who had been silent until this point, spoke up. "Craig, the man whose cabin you moved into is sitting right there. The least we can do is let him talk." Priya seconded. "I'd like to hear from Nathan." Craig looked at the room. People were nodding. He had no procedural basis to refuse. The CC and Rs allowed any property owner to address the board during a noticed meeting. He sat down and said, "Fine, keep it brief." I stood up. I walked to the front. I set the binder on the folding table, and I opened it to the first tab. "My name is Nathan Crossley," I said. "I own the property at the end of the road. I've owned it for 11 years. I am not absent. I am not abandoning it. I travel for work. That's it." I turned the binder so the room could see the first page, a full-color printout from the security camera showing Craig and the locksmith at my front door. On October 25th, Craig Devlin and an unidentified individual broke into my cabin by picking the lock on my front door. I have it on video. 47 recordings over 17 days. Every entry, every exit, every spike strip bolt. The room went silent. I walked them through the binder, page by page, photo by photo. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't editorialize. I just laid out the facts the way I'd lay out a shipping manifest, sequential, documented, and impossible to dispute. The first tab showed the timeline. October 24th, Craig's initial exterior inspection, caught on camera. October 25th, forced entry, interior inspection, abandonment notice taped to the door. October 26th, lock rekeyed, occupancy established with cot and mini fridge, spike strips installed on the private driveway. I showed the timestamps. I showed the footage stills. I showed the image of Craig's associate kneeling at my door with a lockpick set, while Craig stood behind him with his clipboard. The second tab contained the property records. My deed, recorded in 2014. My property tax receipts, paid through 2025. My title insurance policy. The chain of title going back to the Porters in 1987. Clean, unbroken, unambiguous. There was no abandonment. There was no ambiguity. The property was mine, and it had always been mine. The third tab held the board members' signed statements. I read each one aloud. Margaret Cobb's statement said Craig told the board he would conduct a visual inspection and report back, nothing more. Dean Sills confirmed the same. Priya Anand's statement noted that no vote was taken authorizing entry, lock changes, occupancy, or driveway modifications. Hello Pace's statement described the conversation at the HOA meeting, where Craig had first raised the abandoned property issue, and her telling him, to his face, that the cabin was not abandoned. Craig interrupted. Those statements were taken out of context. The board gave me discretion to handle the situation as I saw fit. Margaret Cobb turned in her chair and said, "No, we didn't, Craig. I was very clear. I said, check on it and write a report. You moved your mother in." A ripple went through the room. Someone in the third row, a man named Gerald, whose property was near the main entrance, said, "You moved your mother in?" The way he said it carried the weight of a community realizing something they hadn't fully understood until that moment. I opened the fourth tab, Craig's business history. The dissolved landscaping company. The civil judgment for unauthorized tree removal on a client's property. $38,000. I didn't comment on it. I just held up the printout from the North Carolina Court Records database and let people read it for themselves. Craig stood up. "That has nothing to do with this." "It has everything to do with this," Joan Herrera said. She'd been listening on speakerphone through my cell phone, which I'd placed face up on the table. "It establishes a documented pattern of entering other people's property and taking unauthorized action. It's directly relevant to the board's assessment of your conduct." The room turned. You could feel it, the way you feel weather change on a mountain. 1 minute Craig was the HOA president asking for a vote. The next minute, he was a man standing in front of his neighbors, with a documented history of overreach, signed statements from his own board contradicting his version of events, and 47 video recordings proving he'd broken into a neighbor's home. Helen Pace stood up again. "I'd like to make a motion to remove Craig Devlin from the position of HOA president, effective immediately, on the basis of unauthorized entry into a private residence, misrepresentation of board authority, and conduct detrimental to the community." Dean seconded the motion before Helen finished the sentence. Craig said, "You can't do this. The bylaws require—" Priya Anand cut him off. Article 3, Section 5. Removal of an officer requires a 2/3 vote of members present at a duly noticed meeting. This meeting was duly noticed. By you. The vote was 26-3. Craig Devlin was removed as HOA president in the pavilion he'd reserved, at the meeting he'd called, under the rules he'd invoked. He picked up his stack of unvoted resolutions, put them under his arm, and walked to his truck without looking at anyone. The karaoke speaker sat on the folding table, still on, picking up the sound of the wind through the pavilion roof. The contempt hearing on Tuesday was almost anticlimactic. Craig showed up with a court-appointed attorney. Apparently, Gerald Metz, the bargain attorney he'd initially consulted, had dropped the case after seeing the footage. The judge reviewed the documentation, watched 4 minutes of the security camera recordings, and issued a ruling from the bench. Craig was found in contempt for failure to comply with the original vacate order. He was given 24 hours to remove all personal property from my cabin, restore the original locks at his expense, and pay a $500 contempt fine. The judge also referred the case to the DA's office for criminal prosecution. Craig's mother was gone from the cabin by Wednesday afternoon. I found the cot folded in the corner, the mini fridge unplugged but still there, and the blue ceramic mug sitting on the kitchen counter with a coffee ring inside it. I washed it, dried it, and put it back on its hook. Some things you reclaim one at a time. A locksmith came Thursday morning and installed a new deadbolt, the best one they carried. I also added a steel security bar to the front door and upgraded the window latches throughout the cabin. The crawl space access panel got a padlock. The security cameras got a firmware update and a second backup solar panel. Nobody was walking into that cabin uninvited again. The criminal case moved forward through the winter. In February 2026, Craig Devlin pleaded no contest to misdemeanor breaking and entering and misdemeanor trespass. He was sentenced to 12 months of probation, 200 hours of community service, and ordered to pay restitution of $4,800, covering my legal fees, the locksmith, the security upgrades, and the driveway repair where the spike strip bolts had cracked the gravel base. 3 weeks after the sentencing, Craig listed his property in Ridgecrest Hollow. It sold in April to a young couple from Greenville who wanted a quiet place in the mountains. They introduced themselves to me on a Saturday morning while I was splitting firewood on the porch. Nice people. They brought banana bread. Helen Pace was elected HOA president in the next annual meeting. Her first act was to propose a bylaw amendment requiring a unanimous board vote for any action involving entry onto a member's property. It passed unanimously. Her second act was to reduce the annual dues by $50. It also passed unanimously. Her third act was to cancel the monthly inspection program entirely. Standing ovation. The cabin is quiet again. The tin roof ticks in the afternoon heat. The fireplace draws clean. The cameras run silent on solar power, recording deer and raccoons, and the occasional black bear that still hasn't figured out the reinforced crawl space vent. The reading chair, the leather wingback, still smells faintly of a perfume that isn't mine. I've been meaning to have it cleaned, but some days I sit in it and let the strangeness of it remind me of what happened and what I did about it. One evening in early spring, I was sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the last light come through the tree line. Helen drove up the road, parked at my gate, and walked up with a bottle of local honey and a card signed by 14 neighbors. The card said, "Welcome home, Nathan. It's good to have you back." I set it on the mantel above the fireplace. It's still there, right next to the hook where the blue ceramic mug hangs, clean and dry, exactly where it belongs.
Nathan wasn't there. He was 800 miles away in Memphis conference room, watching his cabin get taken over on the phone screen. And instead of panicking or driving home mid-contract, he documented, he recorded, he coordinated, he waited. That's the hardest thing when someone is in your home. The instinct is to react, to match the violation with immediate outrage. But Nathan understood something most people don't. The best response to someone who acts with the authority is to bury them in documentation, so throughout their version of events can survive. Craig Darwin thought he was dealing with an absent owner who wouldn't fight back. What he was actually dealing with was a logistic coordinator who tracks shipments across 17 states and documents every timestamp and chain of custody. Craig brought a clipboard to a system fight. The lesson isn't just about cameras or attorneys. It's about preparation and patience. Nathan had the cameras because of a bear. He had the footage because he built a system that ran itself. He had the case because he didn't rush. He let Craig dig the hole deeper every single day, then show everyone exactly how far it went. If your HOA has ever overstepped, drop your story in the comments. I read everyone. And subscribe now. Next week, I'm covering the HOA that tried to ban a veteran's flagpole and what a 60-foot easement and a constitutional lawyer did to the entire